Life has a way of lulling a man into a false sense of security. One moment, everything seems perfect, the job, the family, the house. Then, without warning, the ground shifts beneath your feet, and suddenly, you're left wondering how long you've been living a lie. Nick Romano wasn't the kind of man who let himself get caught off guard. He had a way of reading people, spotting deception before it took root. It was a skill honed over years of hard work and experience, a quiet confidence that came from knowing how the world really worked. But even the sharpest men have blind spots, especially when the betrayal comes from the one person they never thought would turn on them. Moving to a small town was supposed to be a fresh start, a way to build something solid for his family. The decision hadn't been easy. He left behind a life in the city, friends he had known for decades, and a career that had once defined him. But Lauren wanted a change. She said the city was suffocating her, that the small-town life would be better for the kids, better for their future. Nick didn't argue. He had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. Besides, the idea of slowing down, of finding stability, wasn't the worst thing in the world. Within a year, they had settled into their new life. Nick landed a steady job at an oil distribution company, and his natural work ethic propelled him up the ranks faster than most men could manage. He wasn't the kind of guy to waste time or take shortcuts. He put in the hours, proved his worth, and earned the respect of his colleagues. In a place like this, that kind of reputation meant something. People noticed when a man pulled his weight, and Nick had always been a man people could count on. Lauren had found work too, a job at a local bank in the insurance department. It suited her. She had always been ambitious, always hungry for something more. She was the kind of woman who thrived in a professional setting, who knew how to work a room and get what she wanted. Nick had always admired that about her. She wasn't the type to settle, and maybe that was part of the problem. The town itself had a charm Nick couldn't deny. It was quiet, predictable, the kind of place where people still looked each other in the eye when they spoke. The kids adjusted quickly, making friends, falling into routines. But Nick, he felt the weight of the change more than he let on. He missed the city, the pace, the familiar faces. He hadn't realized how much he had given up until the dust settled, and by then, it was too late to turn back. Still, he did what a man does. He provided. He protected. He built a life. For a while, it seemed enough. Betrayal doesn't happen in a single moment. It builds slowly, brick by brick, a wall of lies stacked so carefully that by the time a man sees it, it's already too high to climb. At first, it was Lauren's work schedule. She started staying late at the bank. Not just once in a while, but regularly. First, it was a meeting here and there. Then, it was an important deadline. Before long, she was coming home hours after the kids had already gone to bed. "It's just a busy season," she'd say. Nick didn't question it at first. He knew what it was like to push hard at work, to grind for that next step up. He had done it himself plenty of times. But then, it wasn't just late nights. It was weekends. Suddenly, Lauren had extra shifts on Saturdays and Sundays. The bank, she claimed, was short-staffed. They needed her to step up. And Nick, being the man he was, didn't argue. Someone had to be with the kids, and if she needed to focus on her career, then fine, he'd hold down the fort at home. But a man's gut never lies. The first time he felt it, that deep, nagging sense that something was off, was one Friday night. Lauren had sent a text saying she'd be late, caught up in some unexpected paperwork. Nick, exhausted from the week, had put the kids to bed and dozed off in the living room. Hours later, he woke up to the sound of the front door clicking shut. Lauren was standing in the hallway, keys in hand, her purse slung over her shoulder. But something wasn't right. Her hair was too perfect, her makeup still fresh. Not the look of a woman who had been drowning in paperwork all night. Nick didn't say anything. He just watched as she quietly set her things down and disappeared into the bathroom. A few minutes later, the sound of the shower filled the house. A man knows when something doesn't add up. But still, he let it slide. Then came Steve Crosby. At first, he was just a name. Some coworker Lauren mentioned in passing, a guy in the insurance department who had transferred from another branch. Nick barely paid attention. He had his own life, his own work, his own responsibilities. But then, Steve wasn't just a name anymore. He became a presence. The first time Nick met him was at a neighborhood barbecue. Steve showed up late, laughing like he already knew everyone, beer in hand, flashing that easy smile. Nick had watched him weave through the crowd like he belonged there, like he had always been part of their world. And then, there was the way Lauren looked at him. It wasn't obvious. Not to most people. But Nick noticed the small things. The way she leaned in when Steve talked. The way she laughed at his jokes, really laughed. The way her eyes lingered on him a second longer than necessary. A man doesn't always need proof to know when something is wrong. Steve started showing up more often. At first, it was innocent enough. Lauren would mention how he was, just passing through, and decided to stop by. Then, he started joining their weekend outings. The kids liked him. He was easygoing, always quick with a joke, always ready to play catch in the backyard. But Nick? He wasn't so sure. One night, Steve stopped by unannounced, carrying a bottle of whiskey. "Saw this and thought of you, man," he said, grinning as he handed Nick the bottle. Nick took it, turning it over in his hands. A good brand. Not cheap. Lauren poured 2 glasses without hesitation, sliding one towards Steve with a smile. They talked like old friends, trading inside jokes Nick wasn't part of. He sat across from them, watching, listening. His instincts screamed at him, but he said nothing. He wasn't a jealous man. Never had been. But a smart man knows when something isn't right. Then came the nights when Lauren started locking her phone. Nick didn't check her messages, he never had a reason to. But he noticed the way she started keeping it close, the way she'd tilt the screen away when he walked by. And then, one night, as she stood in the kitchen, her phone lit up. Nick wasn't trying to snoop. But when a message pops up in front of you, you can't unsee it. It was short. Just a few words. "Can't stop thinking about last night." Nick's blood ran cold. He didn't recognize the number. It wasn't saved under a name. But he didn't have to guess. A man knows when he's being played. There's a moment when a man realizes he's been betrayed. It's not the anger that comes first, it's the silence. The kind that presses down on your chest, heavy and suffocating. The kind that makes you question everything. Nick stared at the message on Lauren's phone, his pulse steady, his face unreadable. Can't stop thinking about last night. He didn't touch her phone. Didn't scroll, didn't search for more. He didn't need to. A man like him didn't rush into things. He took his time. Watched. Waited. And when the time came, he struck. The next few weeks, Nick played dumb. He didn't confront Lauren. Didn't let her see the change in him. He acted like the same husband he'd always been, working long hours, taking care of the kids, keeping the household running. But now, he was paying attention. He started with her routine. If she was lying, she had to be covering her tracks. She still claimed to be working late. But Nick knew how banks operated, there was no way they had this many late nights. And weekends. Banks didn't keep their employees chained to their desks on Saturdays and Sundays. So he tested her. One night, when she said she was at work, he took a drive. The bank was dark. The parking lot empty. Lauren wasn't there. The next weekend, she said she had to meet with a client. Nick nodded, kissed her on the cheek, and let her walk out the door. Then, he followed her. She drove across town, passing the roads that led to her office, taking the back streets instead of the main roads. A deliberate move. Nick stayed 2 cars behind, keeping his distance, his hands steady on the wheel. He had been in plenty of high-stress situations before, he wasn't the type to panic. 15 minutes later, she pulled into a small parking lot outside a coffee shop. And there he was. Steve Crosby. Sitting at a table by the window, waiting for her. Nick parked a block away, close enough to see but far enough not to be noticed. He didn't need to hear their conversation to understand. The way Lauren leaned in close, the way Steve touched her hand across the table, it told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't just cheating. She was comfortable. This wasn't a drunken mistake or a moment of weakness. This was planned. Rehearsed. Ongoing. Nick's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had seen too many men lose control in moments like this, explode in anger, act without thinking. He wasn't going to be one of them. This wasn't the time for confrontation. Not yet. For the next few days, Nick gathered evidence. If she was lying about this, she was lying about more. One night, while she was in the shower, he checked her purse. Buried beneath the usual mess of receipts and makeup was a bank statement. Large cash withdrawals. Thousands. Nick frowned. Lauren wasn't reckless with money. If she needed cash, she'd use her card. So why was she withdrawing this much? And then there was Steve. Nick started digging. He made some calls, asked around. Where did Steve Crosby live? Who was he before he moved here? One name led to another, until finally, he got his answer. Steve had a small apartment on the outskirts of town. Not a house. Not a place where a man settled down. A hideaway. Nick had all the proof he needed. But he wasn't done yet. He needed one final confirmation. The night he caught her, it was raining. Lauren had told him she'd be working late, again. Nick waited. Watched the clock tick past midnight. Then, he checked her phone. The location history told him everything. She wasn't at work. She was across town. Nick grabbed his keys and drove, his mind cold and sharp. Not angry. Not emotional. Just focused. He pulled up to Steve's apartment building and parked across the street. The rain blurred his windshield, but he didn't need clear vision to see what happened next. A car pulled into the lot. Lauren stepped out. Steve was waiting by the door. Smiling. He held out his hand, and Lauren took it without hesitation. Then, she followed him inside. Nick sat in his truck, his grip tightening around the wheel. No more doubts. No more excuses. Lauren had made her choice. And soon. She'd regret it. A man can take a lot. He can endure the long nights, the distance, the slow unraveling of everything he built. But every man has a limit. And Nick had just reached his. Sitting in his truck, watching his wife step into another man's apartment, Nick felt nothing. No rage. No sorrow. Just a cold, steady resolve. Lauren had made her choice. Now, it was his turn. Nick didn't go inside. Didn't storm in demanding answers. That wasn't his style. Instead, he turned the key in the ignition, pulled away from the curb, and drove home. There was no need for a scene. Not yet. Lauren didn't know he had been watching. And as far as he was concerned, that gave him an advantage. Let her keep lying. Let her dig her own grave. That night, when she finally came home, he was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a whiskey. She walked in, wet from the rain, shaking off her coat like she had just come from work. Nick didn't say a word. She kissed him on the cheek, habit, not affection, and mumbled something about a long night. He watched as she moved around the kitchen, pretending everything was fine. And for a moment, he almost admired it. The confidence. The ease with which she lied. She didn't know that he had seen her. Didn't know that she had already lost. The next morning, Nick got to work. He wasn't the kind of man who rushed into things. If he was going to take Lauren down, he was going to do it right. The first step. More proof. He needed something that couldn't be denied, something that wouldn't let her slip through with another lie. He made a call to a friend at the bank, an old buddy from college who worked in security. It didn't take much convincing before Nick got what he needed, Lauren's financial records. What he saw didn't surprise him. The cash withdrawals. The quiet transfers. Money disappearing, piece by piece. But where was it going? It didn't take long to find out. Steve. Lauren had been funneling money to Steve's account in small amounts. Not enough to raise suspicion, but enough to be intentional. And that was enough for Nick. The next part of his plan was simple. Follow the money. If Lauren was using their savings to support another man, he wanted to know why. So, the next time she worked late, he trailed her again. This time, he didn't stay in the car. This time, he got out. He stayed in the shadows, watching from a distance as Lauren slipped into Steve's apartment. The lights flicked on. He saw them through the window, laughing. Drinking. And then, something worse. A folder. Paperwork. Lauren wasn't just cheating. She was investing in him. Nick didn't need to hear the conversation to understand. Steve wasn't some random affair. He was a long-term plan. And Nick. He was just the dead weight she was planning to drop. A lesser man might have lost it then and there. Might have burst in, fists flying, screaming accusations. But Nick was not a lesser man. He turned and walked away. Because now, he had everything he needed. And when it was time to bring her world crashing down, he'd make sure she felt it. There are two ways a man can handle betrayal. He can explode, let rage consume him, let his emotions dictate his actions. Or, he can do what Nick did. He can wait. Lauren had no idea that Nick knew. That was his greatest advantage. She still thought she was in control. Thought she could lie, sneak around, make a fool of him. And Nick. He let her. He went to work like usual. Took care of the kids like nothing was wrong. He played his role as the trusting husband to perfection, watching as Lauren slipped deeper into her deception. But behind the scenes, he was planning her downfall. The night came sooner than expected. Lauren told him she had another late shift. Said it so casually over dinner, like it was just another normal evening. Nick simply nodded. Didn't question it. Didn't argue. He even kissed her goodbye. And then he followed her. Not to the bank. Not to a client meeting. Straight to Steve Crosby's apartment. He watched from a distance as she got out of her car, glancing over her shoulder like a woman with something to hide. She knocked. The door opened. Steve let her in without hesitation. Nick didn't need to see any more. He turned around, got back in his truck, and drove home. This was the last time she would humiliate him. Lauren came home just after midnight. Nick was already sitting at the kitchen table, waiting. She didn't notice at first. She tossed her purse on the counter, sighing like she had just come from a hard day's work. Still playing her role. Long night? Nick asked, his voice calm. She barely looked at him. Yeah. You know how it is. Lie. Nick let the silence stretch between them. Let it settle. Then, he leaned back in his chair, eyes on her. Anything you want to tell me? Lauren hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough. Her smile tightened. What do you mean? Nick shrugged. I don't know. Just wondering if there's something you need to say. She laughed, shaking her head. You're acting weird. Nick said nothing. Just watched. Waited. Lauren turned away, busying herself with a glass of water. But he saw it. The slight stiffness in her posture. The way her fingers clenched the countertop just a little too hard. She felt it. For the first time, she knew something was wrong. Nick didn't press her. Didn't need to. Because the trap was already set. Tomorrow? She wouldn't just be caught. She'd be exposed. Some betrayals are meant to be handled in silence. Others. They deserve an audience. Nick had spent weeks gathering evidence. He had followed the trail of lies, watched his wife slip into another man's arms, tracked the money she had stolen from their home. He had given her every chance to come clean, every opportunity to stop. She hadn't. And that was her mistake. Now, it was time for everyone to know. Nick didn't pick just any moment to destroy her. He waited for the perfect one. Lauren's bank was celebrating its anniversary, an annual corporate event where the entire staff and their families were invited. It was formal, high-end, held at the nicest venue in town. All of her colleagues would be there. Including Steve Crosby. Nick made sure of that. He called in a favor, pulled some strings. Got Steve's name on the guest list. After all, Steve had been a valuable employee. He deserved to be there. Lauren had no idea. She went about her day like everything was normal, kissing Nick on the cheek before leaving for work, completely unaware that this was the last time she'd leave their house with her dignity intact. That night, Nick dressed sharp. A black suit, polished shoes. He looked like a man in control, because he was. When they arrived at the venue, Lauren played the perfect wife. She smiled, introduced him to her co-workers, acted like nothing was wrong. Nick led her. He played along, shaking hands, making small talk. He even poured her a glass of champagne. Because in just a few minutes, that glass would slip from her hands. The event was in full swing when Nick made his move. He stood in the center of the banquet hall, surrounded by dozens of people, his voice calm but commanding as he spoke. "I just want to take a moment," he said, "to thank everyone for making us feel so welcome in this town." People turned, eyes on him. Lauren smiled, oblivious. Nick's gaze settled on her. "And of course, I want to thank my wife, Lauren. She's been working so hard lately." A few people chuckled. Lauren laughed along, still playing her part. Nick smiled. "But the thing about hard work," he continued, "is that it should pay off. And Lauren. She's been putting in some serious overtime." Lauren's smile faltered. She felt it now. Nick pulled his phone from his pocket. Tapped the screen. And then the images appeared. Lauren. Steve. Together. Projected onto the massive screen behind him. The banquet hall fell silent. Nick turned toward his wife. Her face had gone pale. He wasn't done. He held up another piece of paper, the bank statements, proof of the thousands she had been funneling to Steve. And then, the final blow. "In case anyone here was wondering," Nick said, his voice smooth, steady, merciless, "this is where all that overtime money went." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Murmurs. Whispers of disgust. Lauren's boss looked furious. "Steve?" He looked like a dead man walking. Lauren tried to speak. Tried to say something, anything, to salvage the moment. But there was nothing left to say. Nick had done what he came to do. He stepped back, watching the reality sink in. Watching the woman who had betrayed him crumble under the weight of her own choices. Then, in the stunned silence of the room, he turned and walked away. Because as far as he was concerned, Lauren was no longer his problem. There's a certain kind of satisfaction that comes with watching a liar get exactly what they deserve. Nick had given Lauren every opportunity to do the right thing, and she threw it away. She thought she could betray him, humiliate him, and walk away unscathed. But now, she was the one left standing in the wreckage. The fallout from the banquet was swift and brutal. Lauren was fired from the bank within a week. Her boss had no tolerance for someone who stole from the company, because that's exactly what she had done. She had used her position to move money, and that kind of thing didn't just get swept under the rug. As for Steve Crosby, he disappeared. Quit his job. Packed up. Vanished. Cowards always run when things get tough. Lauren, though. She couldn't run. She had nowhere to go. And Nick made sure of that. The divorce papers were ready the moment she walked through the door after the banquet. Nick didn't argue with her. Didn't yell, didn't waste a second of his time asking for explanations. He simply handed her the papers, his face unreadable. She begged. Cried. Tried to convince him that they could fix things, that she had just made a mistake. Nick had nothing left to say to her. She signed. That was the end of their marriage. But there was one last thing. "The kids stay with me," Nick said, his voice final. Lauren tried to fight. But she had no leverage. No job. No home. No credibility. Nick had gathered everything, proof of her affair, proof of her financial betrayal, witness statements. When it went to court, it was a slaughter. Lauren got weekend visitation at best. The kids stayed with their father. Where they belonged. And just like that, Lauren was out of their lives. With her gone, Nick focused on rebuilding. For the first time in a long time, there was peace in his home. No more late nights wondering where his wife was, no more pretending everything was fine. And then, something unexpected happened. He reconnected with Jen. She had been an old friend, someone who had always been there when life got tough. Jen was different from Lauren. She didn't play games. Didn't hide behind lies. She was just real. At first, Nick kept his distance. He wasn't in a rush for anything serious. He had just torn down the ruins of his past, he wasn't looking to build something new just yet. But Jen. She understood. And sometimes, the best things happen when you're not looking for them. Months passed. Nick had his life back. His kids were happy. He was making more money at work. Everything was falling into place. But one thing still nagged at him. Steve Crosby had disappeared. And something about that didn't sit right. Because men like Steve, they don't just walk away. And Nick, he wasn't done with him yet. Some men learn their lesson and move on. Others, they run and hide, thinking they can escape the consequences of their actions. Steve Crosby was the second kind. After the banquet, he vanished. Quit his job, moved out of his apartment, left town without a word. No one knew where he went, not his former co-workers, not the people he scammed, not even Lauren. And that wasn't good enough for Nick. Because men like Steve don't just disappear. They leave loose ends. And if there's one thing Nick knew for certain, it was this: loose ends always come back to haunt you. It started with rumors. Small ones, whispers around town. Someone had seen Steve a few towns over, lying low in some cheap motel. Another guy mentioned he was trying to start over somewhere new, keeping his head down, avoiding attention. Nick didn't believe in coincidence. He started making calls, reaching out to old friends, people with connections. Men who could find anyone. And just like that, Steve Crosby wasn't off the map anymore. Then, one day, Steve vanished for good. No one could reach him. His bank accounts frozen. His phone disconnected. His belongings left behind. It was like he had simply stopped existing. The police got involved, but there was nothing to go on. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Just a man who had walked out of one life and never stepped into another. At first, people assumed he had skipped town again, maybe running from debt or trouble. But then, the stories started changing. A bag with his clothes and wallet was found at a bus stop. Unclaimed. Untouched. His car was found abandoned miles away, keys still in the ignition. Lauren. She started suspecting things. One night, during one of her rare visitations with the kids, she looked Nick in the eye, her voice quiet. "You had something to do with this, didn't you?" Nick simply held her gaze. Didn't confirm. Didn't deny. Just let the silence stretch. Because sometimes, silence says more than words ever could. Months passed. The town moved on. Steve Crosby became a ghost story, a cautionary tale about men who crossed the wrong people and paid the price. Nick. He never looked back. Because some people deserve to disappear. And as far as he was concerned, Steve Crosby was one of them. Time has a way of burying the past. Wounds heal. Scars fade. People forget. But Nick, he never forgets. 3 years had passed since the night he exposed Lauren and Steve. 3 years since his marriage ended, since he reclaimed his life, since he last saw the woman who thought she could destroy him and walk away unscathed. Now, he had everything he wanted. His kids were thriving. His job had turned into a full-blown career. And Jen. She was more than just a passing connection. She was real. Solid. The kind of woman who didn't play games. For the first time in a long time, Nick was at peace. Then Lauren came back. It happened at a wedding. One of Nick's co-workers was getting married, big venue, high-profile guests, the kind of event where everyone showed up just to see and be seen. Nick didn't expect to run into her. But there she was. Lauren. 3 years older, but not wiser. She had a man on her arm, some new guy, young, cocky, the kind of fool who thought he had something Nick never did. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Nick didn't acknowledge her at first. Didn't need to. But Lauren. She wanted to be seen. She made her way over, that same old smugness in her eyes. "Nick," she said, her tone dripping with fake politeness. "I didn't expect to see you here." Nick looked at her. Unfazed. Uninterested. "You look different," she added, eyes flicking toward Jen. Nick could see it then. The game. Lauren wasn't here just to make an appearance. She was here to provoke him. To see if she still had any power left over him. She didn't. And that drove her insane. The setup came later. Nick should have seen it coming. Halfway through the reception, a scene broke out. Some drunken idiot started making accusations. Loud, public, directed at Nick. "I heard about you," the guy slurred. "You're the one they talk about, right?" The guy who? He didn't finish. Because Nick had already stepped forward, already shut him down with nothing but a look. But the damage was done. The whispers had started. Lauren was smiling. She had set this up. She wanted to humiliate him, turn the tables, make him the villain. She failed. Because what she didn't know was this. Nick was always one step ahead. As the tension hung in the air, Nick made his move. He turned to the room. Calm. Calculated. Unshaken. And then he pulled out his phone. Tapped the screen. And played the recording. Lauren's voice filled the speakers, her own drunken confession from years ago. The night she had called Nick after their divorce, rambling, admitting everything. How she had planned to leave him. How she had taken his money and given it to Steve. How she thought she could get away with it. The room fell silent. Lauren's smile vanished. Nick watched as her own words destroyed her. She tried to speak. Tried to explain. But it was over. Nick leaned in close, his voice low, deadly. "You tried to bury me," he murmured. "But you forgot one thing, Lauren. I bury deeper." And with that, he walked away. Because this time, some endings feel like justice. Others, like closure. For years, Lauren had been nothing but a shadow in Nick's life, a reminder of betrayal, of everything he had lost. But standing there at that wedding, watching her drown in her own mistakes, Nick felt something he hadn't expected. Nothing. No anger. No hatred. Just indifference. And that was the real victory. After the wedding, Nick and Jen packed their bags and left for Italy. It was her idea. A fresh start. A place where he could breathe, away from the ghosts of his past. For the first time in years, Nick let himself relax. The warm air, the quiet streets, the endless horizon, it was the kind of peace he never thought he'd find again. One evening, as they walked along the coast, Jen turned to him and asked, "Do you ever think about her?" Nick didn't answer right away. He had spent years letting Lauren's betrayal define him. Spent nights replaying every lie, every deception. He had chased justice, revenge, closure, and now he had it. But did he still think about her? No. Not anymore. He looked at Jen, at the woman who had stood by him, who had never lied, never betrayed, never left. And he smiled. "No," he said. "I don't." Lauren never came back into his life after that. No more setups. No more games. Some people fade into nothing when their lies stop working. And for all the damage she had done, in the end, she was just another lesson learned. Nick had lost years to a woman who never deserved him. But now, he had a life worth living. A future worth chasing. And for the first time in a long, long time, he was finally free.